Here. So, welcome to the Social Business Model Innovation Lab. My name is Annika Bartel, and I have founded this meetup because I'm a serial social entrepreneur myself, and one of the big challenges that I am facing in my daily work with Ready School of Digital Integration, which is a tech school for refugees based in Berlin and in Denmark. The challenge that we are really facing is that we get a lot of requests. Can you start a new school in Barcelona? Can you start a new school in Seoul? And as much as we would love to scale our organization, what we often see is that people don't necessarily arrive with a big bag of money, but they would really like to do what we are doing. So the question that we as an organization is asking ourselves right now is, how can we continue to grow in the next 5 years? And how can we get bigger in such a way that it's truly sustainable and that we can keep the quality that we have now, but also get even more quality? So in order to get smarter around this topic, we are hosting these monthly online meetups where we're inviting experts on the topic of scaling and on the topic of how to build sustainable business models so that we together can become a lot smarter. So this meetup is a way for us to give back to the community by holding that space that we as social entrepreneurs can get smarter together. And one of the organizations that I certainly have been inspired by for, I think, 10 years or more. I was at Ashoka a couple of years ago in New York as well, meeting with the team. And it's been an organization that I definitely look to in order to get new insights and inspiration on how to build my business in a smarter way. So it's with a great privilege, and I'm really happy to have Loic from Ashoka here, who will be talking to us about their experiences with creating sustainable, scalable startups in the social impact space. So with no further ado, let's all give a virtual applause, which goes like this to Loic. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Anne, for the kind introduction and for the opportunity to be with you this evening. And it seems like a very diverse and exciting crowd, so I look forward to also learning from you. So as Anne mentioned, my name is Loïc. I'm Belgian, but I'm based in Vienna, and I work for Ashoka, mainly supporting proven social innovation and social enterprises to scale their impact and not necessarily their organization in new context. And I think I have more or less 30 minutes, Anne, right? Or a bit less now, maybe, I don't know, just.
No, you have 30 minutes from the start.
Okay, can I just ask you, after 15 minutes, in case I get too excited, that you just remind me that there's 15 minutes left? Yeah, thanks.
Yes, I will do that.
And so if it's okay with you, I'll just frame a bit. I mean, I'll very briefly present Ashoka a minute for those who might not know, but I would like to frame the discussion around first system change, which is really a crucial and the core element and value that we focus on within Ashoka. We are actually even starting to talk about no longer social entrepreneurs, but system entrepreneurs. But so I'd just like to frame it that way, and then show some examples, and then we'll dive into kind of a high-level methodology and some key questions that we use when we support social entrepreneurs to think about their scaling strategy. So hopefully you'll get a bit of inspiration with the examples, a bit of framing, and a bit of a toolkit that you can perhaps use afterwards. And of course, I'm happy, and I think there's time for that, to take any questions and hear your experiences as well. So let me share my screen. And if at any point I'm not clear, please just interrupt me, unmute me. Unmute yourself and interrupt me. Are you seeing my screen? Just maybe a thumbs up. Okay, great. Good. So let me start very quickly on Ashoka. So what we do, we are a global nonprofit, and our vision is everyone a change maker. So we believe that to tackle the huge and pressing social and environmental challenges we have in the world, the ultimate solution is to empower everyone, or at least as many people as possible, to become agents of change. So to kind of embed these qualities of empathy, leadership, entrepreneurship, teamwork, etc. How do we do that? Obviously, our core business, if I can say it that way, was and still is to support social entrepreneurs. We call them Ashoka Fellows. So it's all about finding them, selecting them, and then supporting them. But over the last 10 years, we realized that obviously this was not going to be enough, and we needed these kind of role models and radical innovators, but we also needed to engage other stakeholders in the community. And so we increasingly work with corporates and businesses. We call them changemaker companies. So really pioneering companies that want to embed social innovation or environmental innovation in a very strategic way into their organization and their culture. And we work increasingly with young changemakers and schools. So we, just like we do for social entrepreneurs, we also elect forward-thinking, systemic thinking schools and bring them into our network and build their capacity and support them. So yeah, as I was mentioning, when we look at the Ashoka Fellows, today it's more or less 4,000 of so-called Ashoka Fellows in over 80 or 90 countries in very diverse sectors. But we really look at them from basically 5 criteria. We look for new ideas. We look for ideas that have a proven impact. So we're not focused on startups, but more on somehow established innovations and innovators. This idea, they should have a clear narrative, at least an idea of how their innovation could lead to tipping a system, not alone with others, but changing a system. So that's really core to us. And of course, qualities like entrepreneurial spirit, creativity, ethical fiber, and others. So it's a pretty long due diligence and vetting process with a lot of interviews, and we go really deep, not only in what they do, but even more what brought them there and what drives them and how their childhood was and how they became a change maker. And the way we measure the impact, our impact, but the impact of our fellows is perhaps slightly different from what typical metrics might be when we talk about scale up, where we might see usually, you know, the number of people they reached, the number of jobs they created, the size of their budgets or their organization. We're more interested on metrics like the one you see here, which again relate to this idea of systems change. So 97% of these fellows are changing mindsets and norms or behaviors, if you wish. 90% have seen their initial idea being replicated in one way or another independently in other contexts. And 76% have changed legislation or influenced public policy. So these are the kind of success metrics that we're looking at when we select and support our social entrepreneurs. And yes, as I was mentioning earlier, they're spread a bit all over the world. 4,000 of them, very different sectors, but it's absolutely fascinating for us to, and it's part of our work to understand their patterns, these new trends, and see how we can translate this back into the more mainstream systems and society. Yeah, I'll pass all that. So that was a very brief word on Ashoka. And let me just frame, before we dive into replication and transfer, as we call it here, let me just provide a bit of framing on this idea of systems change, and I'm sure it's familiar to most of you, and you probably have interesting stories and experiences there too. But so what is system change? We see it as, rather than addressing a symptom with a solution, we really see it as a shift in the underlying dynamics which create the problem, and shift these dynamics so that they produce a better outcome themselves for the system. So it's all about looking into the root causes, as we call it, and the underlying barriers and leverage points in a system, which can be resources, which can be rules, legislations, or hidden rules, unspoken rules as well, which can be relationships, and which can be roles. And all these elements lead to results and to ultimately, hopefully, improving systems. I'll be providing examples which will make it hopefully a bit clearer, and forgive me, but I'll go quite quickly on this part because it's not the core topic today. But if you're interested, I mean, I can share more resources, or we can, dive into that maybe another time. But just one example which you might know, for those of you based in Germany, is an Ashoka fellow called Ursula Sladek, and she kind of, in Germany at least, piloted now 20, 30 years ago, this concept of decentralized citizen-owned energy production. Okay, so what is she changing in this system? She's changing the relationships and rules. It's not only the big energy providers who have the ownership and the power, but the community itself and citizens own and have access to power grids. She's providing a new role in this system as citizens become themselves energy providers. And this has led to new results and a blueprint for new energy production and decentralized systems in Germany, for example. A very well-known example is the one of Mohamed Yunus and his micro banking system, which in the meanwhile has been replicated and integrated back into mainstream financial services. What he brought in was a new rule that social capital, being people and community people, could be accepted as collateral, as guarantee to provide micro loans, as opposed to only providing a house or an asset, right? So this was a new resource or rule he brought into the system. And of course, this enabled to provide access to credit to bottom of the pyramid and people who could not afford financial services beforehand. So it's all about, when we talk about system change, and for us, it's really this idea of not only looking at the systems and kind of providing a direct solution to it, but looking underneath the iceberg and really trying to understand which systems are we talking about? What are these different underlying drivers? What are the root causes? And how can we design interventions, and we'll come back to that a bit later, which really have the potential to shift the system? And even beyond that, within Ashoka now, we're talking a lot about frame change. We like to make things a bit complicated, I guess, within Ashoka perhaps, but it's which involves also behavior change, which is of course a crucial element to ultimately change a system, and probably the most complex one. And we see it now with whether it's COVID, climate change, many challenges we face. There's a big mindset element behind that. So I'll skip this. I think I've mentioned it. So it's a bit more than just a problem and the quick fix solution. It's really analyzing and falling in love with the problem more than with the solution, and spending a lot of time understanding really the system, the root causes, what the ultimate system should look like, and then defining what is the journey to achieve this. And how do you, with your organization, contribute, but how do you need to mobilize other stakeholders within the system to achieve this with you? Now, shifting a bit towards scaling in the topic of today, most of you might be familiar with this kind of picture, right? This illustrates the typical scaling in the commercial or mainstream business sector, right? It's basically often you try to grow, develop, sell as much as possible, grow your organization, expand into new markets, and the system is also structured that way, and the incentives allow this. Whereas scaling in the social sector, at least for us, can definitely, and in some cases should, involve scaling your organization and branching. We'll be coming back to that. But we believe that the size of these social challenges and the complexity are so huge that to ultimately really tip the system, we need to consider not only our own direct impact, but what we call the indirect impact. So there's only so much we can all do with our own organizations, and I'll be showing some examples in a minute of organizations that really managed to scale and had million euros budgets and achieved amazing direct impact, but themselves after 15, 20 years realized, I'm still not changing the system, I'm still not achieving the goals I want, and shifted towards empowering others and this idea of indirect impact. So we really strongly believe that scaling at some point, and the tipping point for us, is when you can combine your direct impact with indirect impact. Let's just look into some examples. Apologies, these slides are a bit complex. No need to look at the details, and I'll be sharing the slides if you're interested to look into these case studies a bit more, but let me just summarize them briefly. I'm using here the example of, it'll be four different cases of Ashoka fellows. Kaboom is a US-based NGO dedicated to ensuring that all kids have the opportunity to play actively. They consider that play is a crucial component of growing up. So what's their story over the last now 25 years? They started in the US building playgrounds, basically. And they were quite successful. After 10 years or so, they raised quite a lot of money. They had a budget of something like 20 million euros, so pretty significant for an NGO focusing on this topic. And they built more and more playgrounds. They were really doing well, considered successful. But after 10, 15 years, the founders and the board reflected on what they were doing and said, we're nowhere close to achieving our goal that all children in the US should be able to play actively. And so they completely rethought their approach. They started by opting for a more open source approach. So this idea of indirect impact is illustrated here. They kind of documented all their expertise, methodologies, tools, put this all on their website, and offered in an open source model the opportunity to support community members, other companies, other organizations, and help them build their local playgrounds. So it was no longer them providing this direct service, but them empowering others to do so with them. This was very successful. It allowed them to demultiply exponentially their impact. But still, they realized this is great, and we now have thousands of playgrounds, but it's still not achieving our end goal. So more recently, they evolved, and this is a nice example of system change as well. In addition to what they were doing and still do, they decided to create a movement around play. They created a coalition of various stakeholders in the US promoting the concept of play. But they also started awards, a labeling system, research, advocacy, etc. So they realized they had to bring other things next, in addition to their replication, to really achieve the change they wanted. I hope this is clear. I have to go a bit quickly, unfortunately, due to the time, but I thought it would be interesting to bring in some quick examples. Another one here is Aravind, which is a very famous case study in the field of social entrepreneurship. Very successful eye hospital system, which started in India. Very efficient and with a very interesting approach where bottom of the pyramid, low income population can access services for free, whereas more wealthy clients pay a fee for the service. So it's a cross subsidization business model and pricing model. But what I want to emphasize here is, again, they grew, they opened new hospitals, but the only way for them to really achieve their impact was to start a training center and train others and help others to open their own hospitals. In the meanwhile, over 30 countries and 300 hospitals, and they're extremely effective and impactful organization, delivering eye surgery in India and way beyond. So this is a train the trainer approach, right? With quality standards, etc. But that's it. Aflatun is another really interesting example of an organization focusing on providing social and financial education to millions of children all over the world. They started in India as well here, and piloted, and so grew kind of organically, piloted their own work in 9 different countries just to learn what it meant to scale and be sure that they really had the right ingredients and the right systems and that they were ready, basically. And then they created, in the meanwhile, a global, large, huge network of partners structured under a social franchise system, which work with them to achieve this mission. This even evolved towards a global, again, a kind of creating a separate organization focusing on advocacy and bringing in all key stakeholders and governments in order to make sure that this idea of social and financial education was part of the mainstream curriculum. But so here's an example of organization that completely had to pivot. Obviously, your role when you coordinate a network of over 100 partners all over the world is very different to the role they had before, where they were implementing themselves programs. Nevertheless, it's a team of 50, 60 people, so it's still very small, and they really focus on quality assurance, knowledge sharing within the network, impact measurement, and such elements.
I'm your 15-minute buzzer.
Thank you. I saw that. Yeah. Okay. Last example here, because it's a different approach. Cola Life. So this is an innovation, a very simple, no frills, cheap solution to tackle the issue of diarrhea, which is still a very significant disease and mortality problem in many countries. So this entrepreneur designed a kit, a very low cost, very efficient kit. He managed to scale this in Zambia, so in one single country. It took years with a lot of evidence, a lot of documentation. It was picked up by the government. And then, although his initial idea was to say, how can I now replicate this in other countries? He actually realized there was probably a more elegant way of doing this. And he decided to work intensively to make sure that this product was listed in the World Health Organization list of essential medicine. And by doing that, automatically, all of the countries and governments which refer to the WHO's list are kind of referring to his product. So it's indirectly replicated without him having to go into other countries. So it's another approach. How can you institutionalize perhaps your solution through government adoption? I'll skip all this. I think you got the message around it's about growing your impact mainly. Perhaps it involves growing your organization, but that should not be the end goal. And these mantras around aim for system change, use indirect impact, dare to let go at some point and empower others, which is not easy for founders. So that's a cultural leadership shift as well. And be flexible and adaptive, because if it's about system change, it will be evolving by definition. Now, let's zoom more into replication and transfer in the toolkit that we use there when it comes to that. And again, this is just one approach along many others that we kind of briefly touched upon to achieve system change. And I want to make that clear. It should be a strategic, well thought through decision. Replicating is not necessarily the right thing for every organization. So what are the key questions? The why question, the what, the how, the where, and the who. So which partners? And I'll quickly go through them. The why question is obviously fundamental one at the beginning. And what's the rationale for replication? Are you being pushed to do this by your funders, which we see a lot, and people do it, but they're not ready, or it's not strategic, and in the end, it's a loss of time and resource for funders and for the organization. So it needs to be a strategic reflection. It can be about generating more revenue. It's very often about generating more impact, but it can also be about how can I learn, create a network with other partners and foster more knowledge sharing and continuous improvement, or will this help me position myself as a thought leader and thereby allow me to be more effective in my advocacy work, etc. I won't open the tool now, but you'll have the slides, and there's a link here to a quick online replication readiness check, which I encourage you, if you're interested, to take. It takes you 10 minutes, but it gives you a score as well to assess kind of along 12 dimensions, if I'm not mistaken. How mature are you, or where might there still be gaps that you want to consider before you start replicating? What to replicate may sound like an obvious question, but it's often a difficult one. You can decide to replicate your whole organization and all its components. You can decide to replicate a specific program, perhaps just a specific product or service, or even an app in some cases. Or maybe you decide to replicate principles. So a set of values, of principles, but not more. So fundamental question here, there are different ways to look at this. Again, you'll have all the slides, but you want to probably assess, your current, what we call theory of change or impact model, and your business model. So whatever you have today along maybe dimensions like these, and really try to put yourself in the shoes of potential partners and consider what is it that is most relevant for them. And you can look around dimensions around competitive advantage, of course, for them in their market. You want to make sure that whatever you replicate has already some evidence that it is impactful in at least one context. Otherwise, don't even consider it. There should be some kind around sustainability and business potential. Is it already sustainable? Doesn't need to mean you're generating revenue on the market. It can be a fundraising strategy, but it should be somehow, there should be a track record, and it should be conceivable for partners to make it sustainable as well if they replicate it. And there should obviously be demand both from the market, but from a social need. It should be to some extent documented, if not perfectly standardized. At least you should have some manuals or support tools that you can provide to partners. And perhaps you need some kind of a formal framework. Some elements of what you do today might be easier to formalize in a contractual or financial agreement than others. This is not an exhaustive list. It's just an example of what we use usually to help people assess. An example maybe from Simplon, and I'll use the same example quickly as I go through the same question. Simplon is a digital skills school for vulnerable populations, which has scaled and replicated their model quite successfully in Europe and beyond. So what they decided and what they're scaling or replicating is really a methodology. It's not anything else. It's a methodology. It's a training model, active pedagogy, and different elements behind it, but that's mainly what it is. They're scaling a unique methodology. Now the how question, so what are the different scaling models and which ones do you choose? Might want to look at it on this kind of spectrum from kind of, again, this idea of direct impact where you need perhaps to keep control for good reasons. You might be then less reliable on partners. And there are some considerations around resource and costs. On the other hand of the spectrum, it's more the indirect impact. You lose some control, but you empower partners. It might be a bit faster and less costly. And there's absolutely no right or wrong answer. It's a trade-off between different types of models. On one hand, you see the typical growth model. So you branch, you open new entities and you keep full control. On the other side of the spectrum is dissemination. So more open, loose models where perhaps you train others to do so, or you have an open source approach. And in the middle are hybrid models where we find things like licensing, social franchising, certification models, partnerships. I'll skip this, you'll have it in the slides, but it's just some indications on when you might want to consider using one model or the other. What we do see often is that there's no one perfect model, and various social entrepreneurs end up combining different models depending on the geography, the needs, and the partners. This is again the example of Simplon. How they replicate today, at least, is they have on one hand a kind of controlled scaling, branching approach, where they open and operate the full thing in new countries and keep full responsibility. They have a social franchise model, which they call a partnership model, but that's it. They empower others and keep some control and have common standards, quality standards, and support. And on the other hand, they have a more loose kind of train the trainer model, and they combine these. The question on which target geographies, again, different criteria to look at this. You obviously want to go somewhere where there's a social need and a problem that your solution can meet. Ideally, there's already some indication that local stakeholders need it. Perhaps they have started contacting you, asking how they could replicate it. It should fit your strategy. It should be somehow compatible in terms of perhaps language, culture, systems. There should be some form of advantage. You should have local partners, people able to implement this, and obviously the business and funding considerations are important as well. Again, I'll skip the example here, but this is how Simplon kind of assesses new countries and has defined specific criteria to do so. And then a crucial one is, how do you choose your partners? And before you even choose them, which type of partners do you need? So are you looking, you probably need a local implementer, someone who will do the job, an organization, an entrepreneur. You might need funders, you might need connectors, you might need clients. So define the type of partners, be specific on the roles they should be fulfilling, and then on your selection criteria, what kind of track record, what kind of expertise, resource networks should they bring in? And obviously there's a process then to assess them and vet them. This is very important, so be very intentional and clear on what your roles and responsibilities will be when you scale, and what the roles of your partner should be along all the dimensions of your work. Sorry, I'll skip this. And then, yeah, finally, you package your offer, right? This is the example of Simplon. And by the way, Anne, I guess you know them, but I'm happy to share more because I think it might be really interesting for you as well, because there are a lot of similarities with your work. but they provide kind of a minimum package to their partners, and then some tailored support on demand ad hoc, which is often paid for, by the way, in addition to the social franchise fee that partners pay. But that's how they do it. Others approach it very differently. And I'll stop here. I'll be providing you here some additional resources. There's a couple really short, very insightful videos of Ashoka fellows who kind of in 5 minutes explain how they went about these questions. There's a great toolkit, not from us, but from Spring Impact, which is a fantastic toolkit that we use a lot around scaling and social replication. And there's some link to more stuff around system change. And I can really recommend also a podcast we recently launched on this topic with different entrepreneurs explaining their journey and their failures. I'll stop here. Sorry, it was a bit of a rush. I hope it was digestible.
It certainly was digestible, and it's really good to have your slides afterwards. We already got, or I got a question on how I'm going to share the slides. So everyone who has signed up through Meetup is going to get an email where there's a retransfer link where I will share the slides once I have them as well. So don't worry if this was too fast, you'll have more chance to dig more into it. So in the next couple of minutes, if you have some burning questions, please put those into the chat. We'll take immediate questions now, and then I'm gonna put you into small groups, because what we have realized is it's a lot to take in, but once we start talking to each other about what we have heard and how this actually reflects to our daily practice, things usually settle in a much better and more active way, and then we can come back with much harder and better questions afterwards. So are there any burning questions? Then please put it into the chat right now. So while people might be hopefully typing. Oh, I can see Tasneem, we can't hear you. Now we can hear you. Perfect.
Yes, sorry, there's something going on with my laptop. I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed how you replaced replication with scaling, because I have a big problem with scaling. So I enjoyed the presentation very much. I have a question. It's basically to see, when you open source and you provide your information about how a business is, social enterprise is run, what is the chance or risk that it is sabotaged, or the capitalist interests sink in and they take over and it's profit, and you become you become competition in the wrong sense? So how do you avoid that?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And again, all these models have pros and cons, and it's in the end a trade-off. So open source is definitely the model which is the cheapest, but the one where you lose the most control, or quality assurance becomes tricky. I mean, I don't know, to use an example that, alcohol, what is it called? Alcoholics Anonymous or Anonymous Alcoholics or whatever, I forget the name, but I mean, they just basically have a methodology, a toolkit, and they welcome anyone to open a local chapter, but they don't measure impact, they don't measure quality. So I think it's a model that is not suitable to all types of organizations. If you're working with vulnerable populations or beneficiaries, for example, open source might be really tricky. Obviously, it's also, if you need to generate revenues or hope to somehow generate revenues while replicating, open source is probably not the right one either. But it is, in some cases, a great way to just spread out your experience, your expertise, and help people. There are hybrid ways, so you can still open source. I mean, like the first example, Kaboom, the playground thing, they open source to some extent. So there's a lot of material available on their website, but they do have some mechanism to stay in touch with the people who, they need to log in, they need to agree. So they have some kind of idea and tracing of who's replicating this, and a way to also somehow monitor a bit what's going on. But fair point, it's the one where you lose the most quality assurance and control, obviously.
Great. Any more burning questions, feel free to either put them in the chat or just unmute yourself. I can see that no one is immediately jumping in. I guess from my side, what has been exciting with Ready School is we've followed a scaling strategy called Nail It Before You Scale It, because we wanted to make sure that we actually have an impact before growing bigger, and this has served us very well. Yet at the same time, we have been growing like 10 times in the last 5 years. So I think even with a strategy of not wanting to scale, if the demand is there, it's still possible. But I think from our side, we've seen that the one thing that didn't make us feel like we were scalable yet was that the business model, so how we actually generate money, has not really been put in place, because we are still supported by foundations and to some degree partnerships with companies, and that part has not been scalable. So would you advise organizations that don't necessarily have a sustainable or replicable business model to go into scaling, or is that a part that needs to be put in place before growing too fast?
Yeah, well, thanks for bringing this up, because I realized maybe I didn't make the message clear enough. So I emphasized a lot indirect impact system change. Obviously, the first thing you want to do is scale in a rather controlled way, and it's typically the first step. And it makes a lot of sense to make sure that you're ready, you really master and control everything before you consider empowering others. So sorry if I on purpose was kind of more emphasizing the system change indirect impact thing. On the business model, yes, it is for us a key criteria before you consider scaling. I mean, in practice, you learn by doing as well. So again, it's not, but you should have some evidence that your model is sustainable, which again, for us, does not necessarily mean that it's generating revenues. It can be hybrid, it can be fundraising, but anyway, there should be some sustainability behind it so that partners can live with it, run with it, and be sustainable. But in practice, yeah, there are opportunities, funding opportunities. You need to jump on them as well and learn on the way. It's just we've seen a lot of examples where it just didn't end well because there were so much things that still needed to be prepared and clarified internally before replicating. So I think the business model and the sustainability is a clear and important one.
Great. All right. I think I have bought us a little bit of time. No one has come up with a question yet. So that's a sign that I think it's time to go into the breakout sessions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create automatic groups of 3 people, which usually means that some people will end up being 2, some will be 3, but I hope that you will all stay because this is a great opportunity to network and just have a discussion of how is all this content relevant to the situation that you are in. So I'm going to put you into groups, and then you will have 20 minutes to discuss what you have heard now. It would be great after those 20 minutes if you have questions that we can then discuss in the group. In the end, we'll have 20 minutes as well to ask these questions. So with no further ado, let's the technology do the trick and organize you into groups. So I'll give you a pointer when it's time to come back to the main group. Have fun. Room should be open now.
And I'd like to drop off. I mean, it was a great session, but it's just like, it's 10:30 here. So
completely understood. No worries.
Thanks so much. I did not sign up using the meetup. The Zoom link was in the text of the meetup, so I didn't sign up. I just followed the link. So can I just send you my email separately?
Yeah. Let me just put it into the chat here. If you then send me an email, because then I can immediately reply to that. So it's ready school. Can you see that in the chat?
Yes, yes. Thanks so much. And I mean, like, huge admirer of what you do. We should talk sometime.
Yes, very happy to. I mean, feel free to suggest. Usually just send me an email and suggest 3 times. It would be really lovely to catch up properly.
Okay. Bye. Good night.
Wonderful. Take care. Sleep well.
Or
yeah, I can. There's one saying, Anne will probably know that also, Loic, one saying is people only support what they create. So one question in our group was, how can you find the best balance of, on the one hand, giving tools for people to take over and scale or replicate, but on the other hand, leaving enough space for them to be in that project and process as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's where models, the kind of in this slide where there was the spectrum, the models in the middle are kind of those that, to my opinion, might fit best those needs. So things like social franchising or licensing or partnership models, where typically you define minimum quality standards, perhaps minimum requirements you have from your network of partners, perhaps an impact framework, so 3 or 4 impact metrics that you expect from them, and whatever it is, but you defined a framework, but you allow them as local implementers who know best their local reality to play within this broad framework and adapt your work, your methodology, your tools to the local context. And as actually a lot of organizations that go down this path are a bit scared at the beginning of doing so, because it's a bit losing control and you never know, and sometimes it's not the right partner, and so there are a lot of failures. But usually at some point they discover that these local partners are obviously bringing a lot of innovation back into the network, and so as a coordinator of the network you can benefit a lot from such approaches as well. Aflatum case, and I can send you the detailed case study on Aflatum, is a great example of, I think, a great answer to that question, how they managed to set this up and make sure they allow enough room to local partners to adapt their curriculum, but they have very clear, 5 principles, 4 values, impact metrics, and obligations as well.
Great.
Brilliant, thank you. Super.
I think there was a second group question from that group as well.
yeah, exactly. Johannes, do you want to go, or do you want me to go? Maybe your question about community.
Yes, thank you. The question is how to build communities for replication.
And maybe just a quick addition to that, how do you even find those communities? Like, what is the best and quickest way to either build or find those communities that match your kind of requirements, basically?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a huge challenge in this process, to be honest, as well. I guess it depends, first of all, if it's, if you're aiming to replicate in completely new geographies where you are not present, where it's totally new to you, it's probably even more challenging, because in that case you need to find somehow allies or experts or people who can more or less connect you, validate that the market is appropriate to your solution, bring you in contact with the right people, bring credibility to your solution. So there's no easy answer to that. When it's, growing maybe, or developing or replicating from one, let's say, German region to another, it's probably a bit easier, because maybe a bit the ecosystem, you can get connected to others more easily. The way we're struggling with this, but whereas in the mainstream business sector, there are, every city has a business agency, and it's pretty much their role to help new companies figure out how can they scale in that country and connect them with the right resource, provide expertise, legal, fiscal, etc. There is no such thing in the social sector. So it's what we're trying to build, actually. But for now, we rely on either existing business agencies for some insights on markets, either on other social entrepreneurs who are active in the same geography or in the same sector, academics. In some cases, academics are happy to do, even often for free, a kind of market validation or community or identification of stakeholders. But I have no clear and perfect answer, as you understand, to that question. It's a challenge. I don't know if there are any examples within the group, maybe, or attempts you've made before.
That's an open question to the group. Does anyone have experience or failures to share in this?
I can share just a point that I think when we scaled Ready School to Denmark, it was so important to find someone, which ended up being me, who had a local network and a local understanding of what was going on in Copenhagen, and who could relatively quickly identify which partners was important to have on board. So yeah, that's just an experience that having a local implementer who's relatively well connected is important to identify the right communities. And yeah.
There are some examples. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Anne.
Yeah, I'm just building on what Ida was saying. What we have seen scaling to Munich and to Copenhagen was that the person who was the person responsible for scaling had already been either doing an internship or had been a volunteer at the school. So per definition had already been trained in our methodology. So kind of considering headquarters as a training center before then going into their local home environments to then build the school from scratch. It has seemed to be working, and the culture is replicating in a really nice way.
Perhaps I can add something as well, because we definitely have good experience with localized subnetworks or something like that, depending on the use case. But it might sound like a truism, but what always helped us was keeping in mind that we're dealing with human people. It's especially weird in a connection like we are talking about today with this background of people. But even if you have people that are very dedicated to a cause, it always pays off to say thank you, to offer something to them, to make them see that it's not only for the good cause, but it's good for them as well, because they might make new contacts, or that you do a favor for them or whatever. I know it's a truism, but sometimes we tend to forget that because it's all for the good cause and we all share the good cause, but we're still dealing with people.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I just wanted to mention one example of a project we've been working on recently. To create communities in new contexts, they used their beneficiaries, so the people they work with, kind of mobilize them in the process of defining the replication strategy. And most of them were actually connected to like-minded, similar people in different geographies. So they were able to help create communities. So I thought that was also an interesting way of looking at it. Maybe your beneficiaries can be your partners in opening up new communities.
Sorry, can I just add, because you mentioned in your presentation advocacy, and I think that has a big role to play as well when you're trying to get new communities on board. This is the work I do with the civil society organization I work with, or I've worked with before. So I think it's about creating that storyline and reaching out. It's a lot about networking and giving the right story out so people understand and they can relate and connect.
Yeah,
that's really nice. All right, so I'm just looking at the clock. From group 2, I'm not entirely sure, Ida, I think it was a group that you were in, you came in as number 2. Do you have some questions from that group? Feel free to pick anyone who might be sitting on the question.
So we were actually lucky enough to have Loic in our group. So we kind of asked some questions on the go and had some common reflections. I was asking about reflecting about working with governments, and maybe a question that arises from that we didn't get to talk so much about was, should we compromise our approach to fit into government boxes? Because in Denmark, the governments are the one who's like carrying the financial weight of the problem that we're solving. So everybody is telling us that we should make them pay us to be a part of the solution. But that's just super difficult to figure out how to fit into those boxes without compromising a lot. So that's also a question to the room as well as to Loic, if any of you have any experiences with that and have compromised too much or too little or whatever to fit into boxes to ensure financial sustainability, basically.
Yeah, I just shared in the chat because I had shared it in the breakout, but not in the plenary. For those who are interested more on the piece of how to collaborate with government, there's a complete course with a lot of case studies and resource, which is freely available, open source, so we lose control, but that's on purpose. So feel free to refer to that resource if you're interested. Yeah, also a great question. I'd love to hear from the group, but I think one thought I had there was on compromise. I guess it depends. I would not, there's probably non-negotiables in what you do. Things that are so core to you, to your values, to your impact, those are non-negotiable and non-compromisable, if the word exists. Now, when it comes to how you deliver it, there's certainly tweaks and adjustments that are possible, but my advice would be just make sure that you stick at least to whether it's your theory of change or elements of it, but there should be something that is non-negotiable, and the rest, yeah, it's a lot about compromising where it can be.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing, to identify the non-negotiables is
crucial.
work in progress.
Yeah.
Sorry, Tasmin.
No, it's interesting because I remember I interviewed a young entrepreneur who was launching his business, I think it was Lebanon, around solid waste management. And they were funded by donors and they wanted to work with the government. But the government wouldn't move till a bribe was paid. That's another thing I've heard a lot in social entrepreneurships in India, that it's full of corruption and they have to navigate quite a bit for certain sectors at least. And they went back to the donor and said, look, we have to pay a bribe. And the donor said, just go ahead and pay the bribe. So the young entrepreneur was like, I'm just starting. I have so many ideals in my mind. And this is what advice I get. So it's interesting. It's not an easy answer. And depends where you are. There are certain unfortunate negotiables that you have to live with.
Wow, that's a really powerful story or example. Any more reflections on working with government from the group? Go ahead.
Just a reflection of what Tasneem was saying, just like a phrase that comes to my mind. Sometimes you have to go with the system so that you can change the system. So it's like there's no shame in having to do something that you don't want to do or that you normally would have to compromise or would not even think because you're in a social sector, as long as you know, okay, this is kind of the things that I want to change, and you kind of can have even like the list of the kind of things that you want to change from that perspective. So no shame on that. Like that's part of it. You need to understand the system so that you can actually make the system change at the end of your process. That's part of your theory of change.
Very nice. A Trojan horse into the system. They didn't know what they welcomed in. All right, then let's move on to questions from group number 3. So I guess that's Alejandro, David, Tasneem, and Melanie probably. At least you're placed last on my screen. So was there some questions coming up from your group?
Well, I can maybe connect one, something that we were already talking about, and I think we already started the conversation, but maybe it would be interesting to go a little bit deeper. And it was already sharing with us how you had a trainee that started also the franchise in another country, right? The one in Copenhagen, I think it was, or in Munich. And we were thinking also in our group, like how is the process of scaling also for the team, for the original team? How do we make sure that also the original team feels involved in the process of replication? Because I think there's a lot of knowledge transfer that is coming from the main team that we don't want to lose in the process. So maybe Loic, if you can give us a little bit of an idea of how this process happens or what has happened that you have observed, also maybe for the.
Yes, great, very valuable point. Replicating often involves a change in culture, in skill set, in roles, and in knowledge management dynamics. So a lot of organizational and culture change, which need to be, and the organization needs to be ready for that. So I think it's all about, before, if possible, before you really replicate strategically. I mean, pilot projects is okay, but is making sure that everyone's on board and understands what the implications of this will be in terms of operations, process, organization. And it often also involves maybe even changing leadership to some extent. So we see a lot of cases where the founder is no longer the right person to scale the organization and its impact, which is sometimes a difficult moment, but is healthy for the organization, and sometimes a really crucial step to allow it to happen, for good reasons, right? It's just it often requires a different mindset, skill set, leadership style than the passionate founder who grows and develops it, which is absolutely necessary at some stage as well.
Do you have any advice to organizations that is going into that kind of shift, talking about change of scaling in the next 5 years? Asking from personal experience.
Well, ensure there's alignment. I mean, whether it's with your board, your stakeholders, even some key partners, and of course your staff. I mean, that's definitely a crucial one. Anticipate as much as possible, and that goes back to this point on roles, responsibilities, what you will be doing, what your partners will be doing, but try to identify how your skill set should be evolving, or your culture, or whatever needs to be evolved over the coming years. Anticipate this as much as possible, and at the same time, I think as leaders, embrace the fact that it's a new journey, and you need to remain adaptive, flexible, and there will be drawbacks and surprises. But also the fact that maybe some people, some profiles need to be no longer fit, or vice versa. I mean, we do this over months and with a specific process, but those are some key elements that come to mind right now.
Really nice. Alejandro, did you have more questions from your group that came up?
I think we kind of had one that was a little bit like vague, but maybe Melanie, Tasnim, David, if you want to help me with that one, the one that we had a little bit like more open.
Yeah, I have to admit, I don't remember. I'm trying to remember our questions. We had some.
I think it was to do with Melanie. She was explaining her experience, and then she started a social enterprise in education. If I'm not mistaken, that was it. And then now she has a job and she wants to restart. So the question was, would you like to go back into the same, to invest back in the same entrepreneur enterprise? And she gave a very profound response to that, saying that I would rather connect to the ones who are doing some good jobs, because in that time, a new entrepreneurship has arisen, or a business has come up and they're doing very good work, much better than what I'm doing. So I'd rather connect. So the question was, is there a role of a connector in this whole ecosystem of social entrepreneurships, and what would that be? I think that's the question, if I can articulate it like this.
I think you got it. That's pretty much what we were thinking. You even created it in a better way than we talked during the whole session. Thank you, Tasnim.
Yes, there's definitely a role for connectors, and there's not enough connectors. I mean, there's a lot of roles missing actually for this whole replication or scaling system to work. Connectors is definitely one of them missing. So these people able to establish those connections, broker, networking, contacts, bring in expertise, absolutely crucial, as well as simply the fact that, we're still maybe have the tendency to prefer to set up our own new stuff, although it exists, although your neighbor already created it, rather than perhaps just have the posture of saying, well, it exists, why don't I just replicate and localize and implement what already exists? I don't need to start from scratch. And I think even this role of local implementer, and how can you replicate a proven solution rather than necessarily start something new, is also something that, or mindset maybe, that we still need to work on as well.